All right, I think we're going to begin. My name is Dan Esty. I'm a professor at Yale, teaching in both the Environment School and the Law School. I'm also a former government official, having spent 3 years as commissioner, director, that is, of the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. And in an earlier tour of duty in the U.S. government, was at the Environmental Protection Agency as the deputy administrator, a deputy assistant administrator for.
Hi, Dan. You're back live if you want to keep continuing.
Okay, it's a great pleasure to be with you today. And you have the challenge of our Zoom world and the technical glitches that can sometimes occur. It's my special pleasure to welcome all of you to this program put on by the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, USA Network. And on behalf of the co-chairs, Helen Bond, Gordon McCord, Jeff Sachs, we're all very pleased to have you with us. The SDSN, as some of you will know, is a network of researchers, knowledge creators, thought leaders, and educators who across the United States are working to mobilize action in support of a sustainable development approach to the world, a more environmentally sound future, and particularly bringing focus to and advancing the idea of using the UN Sustainable Development Goals as a tool for advancing that push towards a sustainable future. Our program today is in fact developed by something called the Zero Carbon Consortium. This is a group of nearly 100 researchers, scholars, think tank officials from across the country, and representing 11 different working groups with 21 project leads and co-chairs of the effort. So it really is an extraordinary connection of experts with, importantly, a very serious degree of expertise in all of the sectors that we report on today in introducing to you our Zero Carbon Action Plan, a push to get the United States to net zero emissions by the year 2050. And in doing so, really put the United States back into a leadership posture when it comes to the issue of climate change. So this is an effort really to transition the United States in a way that would be quite significant. It would move us off the fossil fuel past and onto a clean energy future. It would deliver the deep decarbonization that the scientific community has told us is essential. And what I think is particularly notable about this effort you're going to hear about today is its granular focus. It's diving deep into the details of the critical elements of transition that are required. It's got a focus on being, of course, environmentally sufficient, grounded in what the science community tells us is necessary to get to a world that's protected from dangerous climate change. It's designed to be economically efficient and affordable. It's responsive to the current crisis in terms of our circumstances with the public health challenge of COVID-19 and the parallel economic circumstances with the downturn we all face, the job losses that many are suffering from, and the need to reignite our economy and deliver growth. And finally, we see it as politically viable, with a special focus on the transition that is required, the need to pay attention to equity, to really ensure we have a just transition, and again, with a special focus on the communities and the industries and the areas where there might be the most dislocation. So we think this is a particularly important piece of work to introduce at a critical juncture as we move in the next few weeks from a politics focus that's been dominant for so many months now to a policy frame where we're all very focused on and eager to move toward what needs to be done to get America going again. And with that, I'd like to turn the microphone, the virtual microphone, over to my colleague and co-chair of the effort here, Jeff Sachs of Columbia University. Jeff, I hand the virtual microphone to you.
Thank you. I take it. Thank you very much, Dan. And thanks to all of the colleagues of the Zero Carbon Consortium and to all of the 260 participants online right now for joining in this unveiling of the Zero Carbon Action Plan. As Dan has said, the purpose of this plan is to spell out in a clear, transparent, step-by-step manner how the United States can and should reach net zero emissions by 2050. Why net zero by 2050? Because that is the timeline that gives the world, when all countries do that, the chance to keep the rise of temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's a dangerous amount of warming, we know, but it is the global objective to stay below that threshold, because we will pass right by it on the business as usual trajectory. And with 1.5 degrees C as the maximum, we have the fighting chance to avoid runaway feedbacks, whether it's the massive loss of ice sheets or release of greenhouse gases from a melting permafrost, or other so-called positive feedbacks, which are highly adverse feedbacks in the natural system. It is crucial to understand and be aware that major economies around the world, in the lead up to COP26 of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, are taking on the objective of reaching net zero by mid-century. Europe, with the European Green Deal, has done this. Just yesterday, Japan has announced the commitment to reach net zero by mid-century. China made a very important advance in this regard when President Xi Jinping at the UN General Assembly in September announced for the first time the commitment to reach net zero by 2060, a tremendous breakthrough. I believe that it can be accelerated, in fact, to 2050. The purpose of this plan is to be specific, not only to have the targets, but to show the feasibility within reach at very low cost of incremental outlays and huge net savings in terms of the damages that would be avoided, the cleaner air, the improved services. The fact of the matter is that because of the tremendous advances in renewable energy, in low-cost power generation from wind, solar, and other zero-carbon power sources, the dramatic improvements in battery technologies and the advances of electric vehicles, electric heat pumps for buildings, and other zero-carbon technologies, we can make this transformation in the 30 years ahead, even given the complexities of an overhaul of the energy system infrastructure, and do this at very low cost. The backbone of the strategy that we'll be discussing today, and I want to thank all of the leaders that will soon be coming online to explain this program in detail. The backbone is a technology-based pathway analysis, quantitative, rigorous, demonstrating how in every major sector, whether it's power generation, whether it's the residential and commercial building sector, whether it is the transport sector, for example, the shift from internal combustion engine light duty vehicles to electric vehicles, or in the industrial sector, including a shift from fossil fuel use to zero carbon fuel sources such as hydrogen or green methane and others produced by zero carbon electricity. In all of these sectors, spell out a step-by-step transformation over the next 30 years. It will create jobs, it is affordable, it is at low cost, it will be part of the global movement to reach net zero by 2050. As Dan has just said, it will help to put the United States back into a position of co-responsibility for the world, something that Americans so much want, and give us the chance as a global society to stay safe and maintain planetary sustainability in the future. I'm extremely proud of this work and grateful to all our colleagues. And I'm going to turn it back over to you, Dan. And I am looking forward to fantastic presentations by fantastic leaders who have led this work. Thank you.
Jeff, thank you very much. Thank you for your leadership of this effort and of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network prior to that, on which we build in terms of prior work. So it is with that recognition that I want to bring our presenters today to the fore. I'm going to introduce all 9 of them at once, and we will then move quite quickly across the various perspectives. What I also want to invite all of you to do is to begin to put your questions in the Q&A box. We're going to gather those questions, and after the presentations are done, we will begin to answer those questions, steering them to the most appropriate speaker who's presented on the topic that you're most interested in. So let me start with saying we're going to cover a lot of ground. I am going to keep time to try to keep us moving, but we're going to start with Gordon McCord and David Victor of the University of California at San Diego, who along with Vicky Arroyo will be introducing the background, the motivation, and the organizing framework of this Zero Carbon Action Plan. We'll then have Ryan Jones from Evolved Energy Research and Bob Poland from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, who will talk about the infrastructure and economic modeling that underpins the analysis and gives Jeff the chance to say that this is all going to be done at a very modest cost and with significant job gains. So we will present with those two the details of how we come up with that conclusion and the careful grounding in careful, thoughtful data that allows us to make that projection. We'll then turn to Mike Gerard from Columbia Law School and John Dernbach from Widener University Commonwealth Law School, who will dive into some of the key requirements in terms of federal legislative and executive action. Will give us, in effect, the federal government piece of the story of what needs to be done. We then will have Cynthia Rosenschlag and Christian Brannon, who is from NASA Goddard, and they'll talk about the role of states and cities. So one of the other elements of this program that we think is quite notable and important is it's not all federal. It has important elements that are left to the state and local governments as well as to the private sector. So it is really a national comprehensive strategy reflecting the great strength of the United States as a federal government with multiple layers of governance. And we think that that does provide a base for ensuring that this transition, however ambitious it is, and it's a big deal out over the next 30 years, but we think it is grounded in solid analysis that makes it doable and, as Jeff indicated, affordable and appropriate. So again, please start putting your questions into the Q&A box. We're going to gather them there and turn to answering those as soon as the presentations are complete. With that, I turn the virtual microphone over to Gordon and David to start the presentations.
Thank you, Dan. Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the University of California, San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy, which is co-hosting this event and a co-host of the SDSN USA network, just wanted to mention 3 things for us to keep in mind over the course of the hour before giving the floor over to my colleague. First, the decarbonization challenge spans multiple sectors of society, as Jeff told us a few minutes ago, from energy production to transport to buildings to land use, and it requires a large amount of simultaneous investments and behavioral change at federal, state, and local level. Lots of linkages and synergies across sectors and regions complicate the problem. The Zero Action Carbon Plan shows how a network of universities can leverage science to inform this policy challenge. The ZCAP builds on SDSN's years of work on the Deep Decarbonization Pathways project, which lays out a technological pathway to achieve decarbonization. It also builds on SDSN's FABLE project, which charts out what sustainable land use in the US looks like as part of a decarbonized society. Only with these integrated technological pathways grounded in science can a serious set of holistic policy proposals be put together. And the third thing to keep in mind is that the SDSN USA is unique in being able to convene experts from multiple institutions around the country, offering a holistic federal policy framework that university networks can later translate into state and local policy proposals in partnership with state and local governments. This is one of those efforts truly made stronger through partnerships, and partnerships are going to be key to moving the needle on these issues across the country. With that welcome, let me give the floor to my UC San Diego colleague, Professor David Victor.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Gordon, and thank you, Jeff and Dan. I just want to pick up where Gordon left off on the uniqueness of this partnership and say 4 things about the substance of the analysis that you're going to see outlined today. The first is that what's required is unbelievably rapid change in the industrial system. As a student of the history of technological change, something more rapid than, frankly, we've observed at any time, and yet something that's feasible. It's going to happen sector by sector, but we need to think about this in a common framework, because that common framework is going to determine how capital is allocated and other resources are allocated inside the society, and the potential overall, ultimately, to do what we care about, which is to protect the climate. Second thing I'll say on the substance is that energy carriers like electricity are going to be vital to the solutions here. It's going to be easier to decarbonize the energy system back at the source of these energy carriers like power generators and then move the energy via wire. Or it could be that the energy carriers of the future are going to be hydrogen. And I think there's a great contest underway right now as to what the energy carriers are going to be and the role of those energy carriers. One of the areas where I co-led a team inside this partnership was around the future of the electric power system. But it's vital for us to keep in mind that these energy carriers are going to be absolutely essential. Third thing I'll say is about uncertainty. There are just profound unknowns in this, unknowns about technology. A recent International Energy Agency study suggested that maybe 3/4 of the technologies that are going to be needed are not available today, certainly at commercial scale. Unknowns about policy, about political sustainability, and unknowns are not new. We have to design a system that is decisive in its direction and yet is not like Gosplan in assuming that we know exactly how people are going to respond to different policy incentives, not like Gosplan in assuming we know exactly which technologies are going to work. And so you're going to see that interplay between the modeling work that's presented today and then also the sector by sector analyses that are in the larger study, because those unknowns, dealing with those unknowns is essential to a serious policy strategy in this area. And the last thing I'll say is this is in the end a foreign policy problem. We will protect the climate only if almost all nations and industrial sectors around the world protect the climate. And so part of what we're talking about here is a vision for reestablishing American credibility around deep decarbonization so that American foreign policy can be more effective and so that the entire world acts in this area, which is so important. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you very much, Gordon. We're now going to turn to Vicky Arroyo, who's going to begin the deep dive into the headlines from this study and some of the key recommendations. So Vicky, I pass the virtual microphone to you.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm so happy to be with my colleagues in introducing ZCAP today after several months of hard work by a really dedicated team of academics and others with expertise across several economic sectors. This year, there have been a number of other thoughtful and interesting proposals that have emerged for climate policy and action. Many actually came out after our initial work together had started. We believe that ZCAP complements these other reports that have been released by other think tanks, academics, and policymakers, and even political candidates, and we hope that this will make a meaningful contribution. ZCAP has been assembled by a large team, as you've heard, with expertise and experience across disciplines, with lead authors that have worked to inform the overall modeling of the report and the recommendations, but also to engage in our own substantive sectoral issues with a team of people who have expertise in those specific areas. So as David mentioned, he did leading work on the electricity sector, and my team worked with the transportation sector with Dan Sperling and others. It is both comprehensive in its coverage, as you'll see from the sectors listed here, and granular in terms of pathways assessed for decarbonization. The sectors covered are power generation, transportation, buildings, industry, land use, and materials. And similar to other recent reports, our target, as you heard from Jeff, is net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. ZCAP lays out an ambitious strategy with targets in these key sectors and a domestic US focus at all levels of government. It provides a great deal of modeling to inform policy and projections, and you'll hear more about that in a moment. It also builds on carefully structured technological analysis and transition pathways that demonstrate the feasibility of reaching the net zero target, with detailed analysis for key sectors across US regions and elements of our energy system. And as you heard, it builds on federalism with direction from the federal government and partnership with states and locals and the private sector. Key components for the new green growth model presented in the ZCAP include these: rapid upscaling of renewable energy, electrification of the economy whenever electricity-based energy is economically feasible and practical, transition to hydrogen, advanced biofuels, and other clean fuels manufactured with zero carbon power, sustainable forest and agricultural lands practices, reduced material waste through sustainable materials management, rejuvenation of the industrial heartland of America with emphasis on the Appalachian region and the Midwest, government-backed financing, investments, and regulatory support at all critical stages of transformation, including for job training in new sectors, and a national RD&D strategy, that's research, development, demonstration, and deployment. The ZCAP strategy for transitioning away from a high carbon energy system to a low carbon energy system builds on three main pillars. One, using energy efficiency. Two, decarbonizing electricity. And three, switching from fossil fuel combustion to electricity in most current uses. And the underlying analysis recognizes that reaching net zero emissions requires an additional strategy of carbon capture and storage. ZCAP offers a framework for thinking about how to bring about large-scale change through technological change. The US economy requires deep technological changes to be at the forefront of new and emerging global industries and innovation. This plan builds on regulations and market incentives to promote rapid adoption of zero emissions technologies and practices. Federalism. All levels of government have significant roles to play in curbing greenhouse gas emissions. Federal government leadership is essential, but states and locals and tribal governments have been leaders on climate and clean energy, and they have important authorities regarding retail electricity regulation, transportation planning, land use, building codes, and more. And it's really important to build on and support these efforts in setting national standards and moving forward together. On foreign policy, of course, the US needs to rejoin the Paris Agreement and help to lead the world towards decarbonization. And finally, industrial policy. With federal support, US high-tech industries and advanced technologies can be vital parts of the solution, as we've seen with American innovation, including the internet, biotechnology, computing, and more. These goals should be achieved while tackling other important societal challenges and providing for a just and equitable transition away from fossil fuels, with access to all for high-quality clean energy jobs. Work to craft and implement actual climate policy must, of course, ensure procedural and substantive opportunities for engagement to ensure that important environmental, equity, and economic goals are met. Such goals include addressing degradation of our air, water, and land while tackling climate change, which, like conventional pollution, often hurts low-income communities and Black, Indigenous people, and communities of color first and worst. Facilitating a just and equitable transition is discussed, yet of course this subject requires intensive and extensive engagement by policymakers and the public, especially those in most affected communities, to craft and implement effective policy solutions that work for all. And finally, research, development, demonstration, and deployment need to be accelerated through at least a tripling of the current investment while working to identify and eliminate barriers to innovation and implementation. Back to you, Dan.
Thank you very much, Vicki. Really a pleasure to hear your dive into the details. And it really is an important part of our conversation to understand what sets this ZCAP apart from other efforts and why it, we think, breaks new ground in terms of its sector-specific on-the-ground analysis, and frankly, for its taking on board the social dimension of the transition, of understanding in particular the need for equity in dislocated communities and individuals. So with that, I want to turn now to some of the pathways to decarbonization. And Ryan, we're going to start with you. So let's have you step up.
Great, thanks, Dan. Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Jones. I'm one of the co-founders of Evolved Energy Research and a partner with SDSN in this important research effort. So I'm going to outline over kind of the next 8 minutes here some of the kind of characteristics of this technical transition to net zero that we're discussing. So together we set out to answer a number of research questions that have in part already been introduced. So first, is it technically, feasible for the US to reach net zero or net negative emissions by mid-century? And if so, what are the least cost pathways to do so? Second, when we factor in different societal or environmental constraints, how do those impact the findings? And then finally, recognizing that variable renewable resources are likely going to make up a large mix of our electricity system in the future, how do we operate these systems to maintain reliability and affordability for customers? So our approach was to develop different scenarios to compare their infrastructure outcomes, emissions, and costs relative to a reference case based on the US Annual Energy Outlook. We began with a scenario that we call the central case, which is the least cost pathway that we found to reach net neutral carbon emissions in 2050, and then ran a set of 8 sensitivities on that central case, testing things like fossil fuel or prices, technology costs, different environmental constraints related to land use, biomass availability, consumer uptake of different efficient or electric technologies, and trying to understand how each of those kind of factors impacted this transition process. Next slide. So just to cut to the chase here, we found in our research that transitioning to net zero by 2050 is feasible, and that we can do so while maintaining a robust economy in the US. In this figure on the left, you see annual CO2 emissions for the reference case and our central case. And then on the right, cumulative CO2 emissions from 2020 to 2050. Our most stringent emissions case, which reached negative 500 million metric tons of emissions in 2050, had a cumulative budget of 72 gigatons, which is consistent with returning atmospheric CO2 concentrations to 350 parts per million by the year 2100. Next slide. So across the scenarios, and Vicky mentioned these just a moment ago, we found essentially 4 what we call pillars of decarbonization that were common across each of the scenarios that we studied and ran. These are kind of in order across the slide here. Electricity decarbonization, where the benchmark was a 95% reduction in emissions intensity from electricity. Second, energy efficiency, with the benchmark that we found being a 40% reduction in per capita final energy demand. Next, electrification, which is a very critical strategy in this transition, and we found a 300% increase in the share of energy from electricity. And then finally, carbon capture, which did not necessarily presuppose where that carbon went. So in our central case, we found that of the 800 million metric tons captured, about 300 million metric tons was sequestered, and the other 500 was actually used in synthesis of liquid and gaseous fuels. And that ratio ranged across our different sensitivities. Next slide. So on this slide, we see 2 Sankey diagrams, and these show the flow of energy across the economy, starting with on the left primary energy, and then flowing through to final energy demand on the right. The width of each of these bars is indicates the amount of energy flowing. And so just 3 observations here to make in these Sankey diagrams. So the first is that when we look at where our primary energy is coming from, comparing the current energy system on the left and the 2050 central case on the right, we see this transition from coal, natural gas, and petroleum to predominantly renewable resources, solar, wind, and biomass, with some levels of natural gas and petroleum found to still be in use in 2050 in this least cost scenario. Second is the kind of growth in electricity generation and use of electricity, both as an intermediate and final demand. So that you can see at the kind of top of each of the figures, indicating the amount of energy flowing through the electricity system. And then finally, the system here on the right is one that provides actually more energy services to more people in the U.S., but does so with much higher efficiency than the system on the left. And you can see that by kind of just the smaller flows across the economy, and that is achieved by same fuel energy efficiency, and also through electrification. We're able to, instead of combustion, get much more efficient use of energy, and so that is kind of very apparent in these sectors like buildings and transportation there at the bottom, where final energy demand has been reduced significantly. Next slide. So across our scenarios, we found that this transition was possible while keeping the cost of the energy system as measured in a percent of GDP near the levels of historical lows. So our net cost across sensitivities was between 0.2 and 1.2% of GDP annually in the year 2050. And the incremental cost of zero carbon technologies was really offset by savings in the cost of fossil fuel purchases. Next slide. So as Gordon kind of mentioned in the setup to this work, there are still significant uncertainties that kind of emerge out of the modeling. But we found that for the most part, the scenarios that we studied diverged after the year 2035. And then across our pathways, there was a high degree of consistency over the next 10 years regarding the actions or the benchmarks that we need to hit to be on this least cost pathway. And so this is kind of a summary of some of the findings. The first being in the electricity system, we need to rapidly expand the share of electricity generated by renewables, and also eliminate coal generation by the year 2030. Energy storage is going to have an important role to play in this high renewable transition, and we have kind of benchmarks for that market transformation. The gas and existing nuclear fleet we found in this least cost transition were maintained at really the current level to provide reliability and to provide zero carbon generation in the case of nuclear. And then finally, for on-road transportation, targets here for both electrification or adoption of fuel cell vehicles, showing kind of a very rapid pace of new adoption. Heat pump use in buildings, as well as kind of improvements to building shell and appliance efficiency. And then finally, not investing further in new oil and gas transportation facilities, because in this type of system transition, we found that there was a high risk of those assets becoming stranded. Thank you. Back over to you, Dan.
Ryan, thanks so very much. Great to have your explanation of the various ways we're going to get to net zero by 2050. As you'll see in the Q&A, there's already a number of questions coming in on some of the details, so I hope you can answer some of those directly through the Q&A. Others we will try to take up for the broader group at the end. With that, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Bob Poland, who's going to give us an overview of the impacts of this transition and really dig in on how we achieve a just transition, addressing the equity issues that have really become very much part of the strategy. Bob.
Thank you very much, Dan. I'm very happy to be part of this important project. And what I was asked to do with my coworkers is to estimate the impacts on employment of the model that you just heard Ryan Jones present, the Williams-Jones model for getting to net zero. And so what we're going to focus on is what Ryan was just describing as his so-called central case, the least cost path to getting to net zero. And what we're going to do is estimate the job impacts of that central case, both in terms of supply expenditures on new energy sources and the shifts in the nature of demand, for example, heat pumps and electric vehicles. And so we do the job creation through those kinds of expenditures relative to what Brian was calling the reference case, the Department of Energy's case in which we do not get to net zero. Okay, so what we're looking at here in this table is our estimate, and these are annual average figures of job creation, central case minus reference case. And what we do is we look at three channels of job creation. So you can see we have direct jobs. Direct jobs are the jobs that are actually created on site from any given kind of activity, like building an electric vehicle. Then we have indirect jobs. Indirect jobs are basically the supply chain jobs. So not only are you building an electric vehicle, but you have to have steel, you have to have glass, you have to have plastic. That goes into building the electric vehicle. So that's what we call indirect jobs. And the third source of job creation, which is here in the on the right-hand side of the table, are induced jobs. Induced jobs, if you remember from macroeconomics 1, that's essentially the multiplier effect. So that when more people have employment, they have money in their pockets, they spend the money in their pockets, at least a share of it, and that creates more jobs. So these are our estimates, and we've estimated job creation under two scenarios. Number one, in which the level of domestic content from this clean energy activity is fixed at its current level. In other words, the percentage of imports that we bring in to build out this clean energy economy stays the same as its current level of imports. And then the second scenario is a more aggressive approach in which we say, okay, we're going to do this on the basis of building up the US activities, so all the way to 100% domestic content. We don't expect to get to 100% domestic content, but we do show you a range. And you can see here down in row 3 our estimate of these job creations. So direct and indirect jobs, we're looking at between 2.3 and 2.7 million jobs. And relative to the share of the labor force, the average labor force between now and 2050, that's going to be about 1.5% of the labor force. When we add induced jobs, we're up to about 2.5% of the labor force. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at, direct and indirect, about 2.5 million jobs. Add induced, you got about 4.5 million jobs. So in a world in which, say, we're at 8% unemployment now, this program, all else equal, would get the unemployment rate down to about 5.5% all by itself. Okay, next slide, please. Now, another critical question, and it's been raised, what about the workers and communities that are going to be negatively affected by the contraction of the fossil fuel industry? So when we talk about just transition, this has to be a central question, and we spent a lot of time working on this. And again, we work from the model that you just heard Ryan Jones describe at the rate at which the coal industry, fossil oil and gas, respectively, are contracting in the Williams-Jones model. Okay, so very quickly, what we have here, the total workforce for all fossil fuel activity, including ancillary industries, I can go through details later, it's about 2.5 million people, of which 150,000 are in coal and the rest are in oil and gas. Now, look, what we're observing is under the Jones and Williams model, essentially the coal industry contracts to near zero by 2030, and then oil and gas does its contraction from 2031 to 2050. Now, in the 2030 transition, what we're seeing is where all of these 151,000 jobs are going to be gone, but if we do it as a smooth transition, that means 15,000 jobs roughly are going. Now, then we also incorporate demographic features, that is specifically, what is the likelihood of people retiring over this decade? And what we estimate is we're going to see about 3,000 workers retiring voluntarily, which gets us to this result, which is critical. The critical result is from now to 2030, we're looking at about 12,000 workers who will be displaced. In other words, they're not voluntarily retiring and their jobs are going to go away in the coal sector. Those people, all 12,000, have to be targeted in a just transition program. In the 2030 period, there will be no displacements in fossil fuels because in the Jones-Williams model, the contraction is very modest and the retirements based on demographics are going to be about 38,000 people. And so that there will be no displacement there. But now let's go to the next slide. So in the 2031 to 2050 period, yes, we will see significant job losses in oil and gas. And so we've broken that one down as well. So what we estimate, we're looking at about 80,000 jobs lost per year, but we're also looking at about 57 people voluntarily retiring, which gets us to about 34,000 jobs that people that will lose their jobs, they are not going to retire, they need to be put into new employment opportunities. Now let's just scale these two things quickly, and then I want to talk about the Just Transition program that we propose. As I said, we're looking at, depending on whether you include direct, indirect, or direct, indirect, and induced jobs, we're looking at about 2.5 to 4.5 million jobs per year generated by the Williams-Jones model to get to net zero, 2.5 to 4.5. By contrast, what we're looking at in the first decade of the transition, when it's a coal phase out, we're looking at 12,000 jobs, people that need to get replaced into new jobs. And even in this latter period, we're looking at 34,000 jobs. 2.5 million to 4.5 million versus 12 to 34,000. This is, at least analytically, an easy problem to solve. It's overwhelmingly a job creation model relative to the jobs that are going to be lost in fossil fuels. Next slide. Next slide. So then the final thing that I want to go through quickly is, okay, we're going to give all those workers, the 12,000 workers in the 2130 period, and then the 2031 to 2050 period, we're going to give them a generous, just transition. And it includes the following three things. Number one, income support. And by income support, we mean if a worker loses her or his job, then they, when they transition to a new job, they're guaranteed the same wage as they were making as a fossil fuel worker. Secondly, retraining support for all the people that need to be trained into new employment opportunities. And three, relocation support for people that need to move. Okay, when we do all that for the 12,000 workers in the phase one and the 34,000 workers in phase two, here's how much we come up with in terms of the budget. $1.5 billion per year in phase one and $3.5 billion per year in phase two. These numbers are minuscule scaled to our economy. It's less than 1/100th of 1% of GDP, the average GDP that would be sustained over the course of this 30-year transition period. So it is a matter of just doing it. It can be done. It can be done cheaply. In addition to this, we also want to insist that all the workers that are going to be phased out and the workers that are going to voluntarily retire, that their pensions have to be guaranteed. This can be done almost entirely through regulatory policy. Finally, I would just mention that as it is, the jobs that exist in fossil fuels and the jobs in clean energy right now are way disproportionately jobs held by white males. And so that we want to insist that we have affirmative action policies that will create opportunities for women and people of color. We want to have job training that will enable people to move easily into these. And we want to have a strong union representation so that these jobs are high quality jobs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you in particular for the detail of the analysis and the careful laying out of the foundations on which your work builds. And for those who are interested, I'd really encourage you to dig into Bob's chapter 3 of our report. It'll give you more in the way of information on the methodologies, the analysis, the assumptions, all of which is spelled out in great detail, and I think does give this a vision that's really much more solidly grounded than many in the past. Up next, I'd like to welcome John Dernbach and Michael Gerard, who are going to walk us through, as I mentioned earlier, some of the key federal policy recommendations as part of this broad strategy. So first up, John, and then Mike.
Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be part of this important project. What I'm going to do is make some statements about the overall approach that we propose taking within a federal legislative and administrative framework. And Michael's going to get into the details on the specific pillars of deep decarbonization and what proposals emerge from those. A starting point, though, perhaps, is that the Sustainable Development Solutions Network sponsored 2 reports back in 2014 and 2015 on how the U.S. could decarbonize the economy. They're predecessors to the work that Ryan outlined earlier. And Michael and I prepared a book describing more than 1,000 legal recommendations for decarbonizing the U.S. economy based on those 2 reports. That book was published a year ago by the Environmental Law Institute, Legal Pathways to Deep Decarbonization in the United States. And what we're going to be talking about today is a series of recommendations that builds on, but is not the same as those in that report. Next slide, please. The starting point here is a zero carbon action plan committing the United States to a binding goal of either net zero or net negative anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. With respect to intermediate goals, we're particularly interested in goals for the next 10 years. As Ryan indicated, there's a lot more specificity and certainty about what you can accomplish in the next 10 years. And we also think sector-specific emission reduction goals are important. One thing that's worth outlining here or emphasizing is that we're talking about a national strategy extending over a 3-decade period. And that's something that is really important to understand, is the importance of having continuity in that over that 30-year period. Next slide, please. So a starting point on that is a White House Office of Climate Change, which would coordinate federal action on this, federal agency action on this. We had some discussion about whether there ought to be some kind of cabinet level agency on climate change, and we decided against that because there are so many federal agencies doing so many different things. But we thought also that it was important for Congress to set a legal structure for ensuring that there would be the kind of continuity that I was describing. And the legal structure begins with a requirement that the administration create a specific national enforceable plan by January 2022 to ensure that the country is on this path toward carbon neutrality, requiring that each administration update the plan every 2 years, and requiring an annual report on progress to carbon neutrality. These are all things that we think are important to keep the nation on course for the kinds of reductions that are required. Next slide, please. So there are a set of recommendations that we made beyond sort of the overall goal that go into specific issues that are not really related to the specific pillars, but that cut across all of the pillars. You've already heard a reference to a recommendation for tripling research, development, demonstration, and deployment. There's a bunch of things that we know how to do pretty well, and there's a bunch of things for which there's a great deal of uncertainty. Negative emissions technologies and carbon capture and sequestration are just 2 of those. And our thinking process is that a lot of work needs to be done to be able to develop those technologies at scale as soon as possible. And that's an important role for the federal government to play. With respect to the social cost of carbon, we had a social cost of carbon under the prior administration. We think the federal government should establish that again. at a scientifically based level. And that ought to guide federal decision making on regulations, cost benefit analysis, and the like, to ensure that the that the actions of the executive branch comport with the kind of reductions that are needed to keep us on course for the 2050 goal. And finally, on this slide, with respect to carbon pricing, we had a long discussion about carbon tax versus cap and trade and all of the rest, and we decided not to take a formal position on that, but rather to simply say that some kind of carbon pricing is going to be necessary to make this work. Carbon pricing is not a silver bullet. You need all sorts of other legal instruments to get rid of obstacles and to sort of clear the way for other things to get done. But we think carbon pricing is an important part of this. Next slide, please. For those of you who've been following what's been happening over the last several years, this is probably no surprise. We think that the federal government needs to reinstate many of the Obama era regulations that were adopted with respect to climate change and strengthen others. The Clean Power Plan is probably not something that we're going to see in a new form if we have a new administration, but it's some form of strengthening regulation for coal-fired power plants is going to be terribly important. On subsidies, we think the federal government ought to eliminate monetary fossil fuel subsidies except for direct payments to low-income households. And consistent with what Robert Pollin said just a few minutes ago, we think that in every single thing the federal government does, it needs to foster a just transition for those communities and individuals who are dependent on a fossil fuel economy, and also to ensure that minority and low-income communities are protected. And with that, I turn it over to Michael.
Thanks very much, John. Next slide. So John has talked about the various cross-cutting issues. I'm now going to talk about recommendations specific to each of the pillars that Ryan Jones discussed in his presentation. So first, with respect to decarbonizing electricity, we're calling for a national clean energy standard for electricity and for promoting the large infrastructure investments that are required to meet those targets. We're going to need a very large program for construction of offshore and onshore wind, utility scale solar, distributed solar, the associated transmission and storage. And this is where a lot of the jobs that have been talked about would be coming from, this very large construction program. We are calling for, as this has been mentioned before, a mandate for phasing out coal-fired electricity generation by 2030. And as Bob has discussed, making adequate provisions for the displaced workers as part of that, and adopting a low carbon fuel standard for the remaining uses that we have for liquid fuels for transportation. Next slide. Energy efficiency and conservation is a key pillar. We already have an Energy Policy and Conservation Act, which empowers the Department of Energy to take certain actions to require greater energy efficiency standards, that the authority of DOE should be strengthened and expanded, and multiple efficiency metrics should be allowed. And to make sure that this happens on a timely basis, the Department of Energy should be given binding deadlines for adopting and strengthening the standards. We also think that steps need to be taken so that most new buildings be fossil fuel upon construction and have meet aggressive standards for energy efficiency and carbon reduction. Next slide. The next pillar is electrification of transportation and buildings. Here we need a tightening of the greenhouse gas emission standards and fuel economy standards for passenger vehicles to compel them eventually being phased out, internal combustion engines being phased out and being substituted by electric vehicles. For heavy duty vehicles where electrification may not yet be feasible with current battery technology, encouraging hydrogen and low carbon biofuels, working on the necessary massive infrastructure program for electric vehicle charging stations, again, for long haul trucks and aviation and shipping, prioritize advanced biofuels and require the a reduction in their life cycle costs, and setting up a model national energy code for buildings for use by the states. Next slide. Carbon capture requires a very substantial additional research development and demonstration program for both carbon capture and negative emissions technologies. And we should also have a strategy to achieve a national reforestation goal by 2050. Next slide. Most of the discussion is about CO2, but there are also other important climate pollutants, methane, nitrous oxides, fluorinated compounds, and black carbon, and we have detailed recommendations for dealing with each of those pollutants. Next slide. And finally, of course, the U.S. Should rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement, set a new, stronger, nationally determined contribution for U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, ratify the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol on ozone depleting substances, and the U.S. should begin to reestablish foreign policy leadership by, for example, supporting the 0 by 2050 commitments that we are hearing from other countries around the world. Now back to Dan.
Mike, thank you very much. Thank you, John, as well. That was enormously helpful to have you walk through what the federal dimension of this will be. As we've now mentioned several times, the strategy here is one that involves all levels of government, as well as the private sector, and really does reflect the kind of diversity of capacity that the U.S. has to bring to bear to deliver on this challenge of moving towards a deep decarbonization, low carbon economy of the future. And with that, we're going to turn the discussion over to the city and state level. And we'll start with Cynthia Rosenzweig and then Christian Brennan. Cynthia, you're up.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Jeff. And we want to thank our team of experts on the States and Cities chapter in the ZCAP report. States and cities are key to the development of decarbonized infrastructure and the implementation of effective policies. We've long known that states and cities have been early adopters of climate action in both mitigation and adaptation. They have experience. One, because they are the sources of a large proportion of greenhouse gases, and they are also on the front lines of extreme climate events. So what this is showing, has been mentioned several times already in the webinar, is that while we need the very strong federal level effort on policies, we need collaboration and coherence across federal, state, and municipal levels, all together working in concert. Now, even if we had all three of those, we need not only public policies, but we need the public-private partnerships that are key to scaling up actions at state and city levels. This involvement of the private sector is essential for the states and cities to actually fulfill their frontline roles. And finally, especially in states and cities, they play a vital role in to ensure that underserved communities are not disproportionately burdened. This is where those communities actually live. Please continue. Next one is, so following on this theme of aligning policies across scales, we've picked out three here to highlight. The first is around transport. We need to have state and city land use policies that promote densification, transit-oriented development, and complete streets. That's thinking about streets from the beginning, during, and after all of the elements of streets and how they can be sustainable and zero carbon. We need the second key area is on buildings. These are where the buildings are, right? Very often in the cities. So we need to align municipal incentives and programs for building retrofits, 95%, I'm in New York City, 95% of the buildings in New York City are already here. So we are going to need to align the retrofit programs with the state climate goals to require efficient retrofit of existing buildings. And finally, the waste, right? Though since waste collection is such a very, very key part of what happens in cities and municipalities, this establishment of the contracts, and these are often done on a city by city, municipality by municipality scale. This is why having those zero carbon or sustainable hauler contracts are so important. I'm now going to turn over to Christian Branian, the co-lead of the chapter, who's going to give more of our specific recommendations arising from the States and Cities chapter. Christian, over to you.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Policies to reduce vehicle emissions are largely under the jurisdiction of federal and state governments. And while vehicle emission standards at the federal government level are vitally important, state governments do have instruments that include the design and retrofitting of their transportation fleets, public transportation policies, as well as public infrastructure, such as charging stations on state roads. So there's an important role that states can play by setting state level vehicle standards and zero emissions vehicle policies. For example, California's zero emission vehicle requirements have accelerated emissions reductions nationwide, as well as the development and commercialization of advanced technologies. It's also important to link funding to metropolitan planning organizations to per capita vehicle miles traveled reductions. States and cities should create pricing systems that encourage more intensive use of vehicles, particularly electric vehicles. And this can happen through links to vehicle miles traveled. There can be incentives for multiple occupants in transportation network company vehicles and personally owned vehicles. And these could also be tied to congestion pricing and parking policies. Next slide. And so, public sector finance can facilitate action, and public resources can be used to generate investment by the public sector. For example, it's critical to encourage research and development investments towards industrial process, product redesign, as well as electric and low carbon manufacturing process development and enhanced material efficiency. Federal and state governments can work together to revise building and infrastructure codes. Cynthia touched on this, and this can incentivize commercialization of green industrial products. However, the private sector contributions should extend, beyond financial investment. There's a critical role utilities can play, and cities and states have been showing tremendous leadership in their ability to collaborate with the private sector to promote sustainability while enhancing safety and livability. For example, the city of Houston partnered with the private sector to provide or to convert 165,000 conventional light bulbs to LEDs. Another example is Colorado. Colorado's home to an important new all-electric housing development that will demonstrate the use of heat pumps with a goal to better match the building loads to the utility supply. And so while states and cities are key to the development of decarbonization infrastructure and the implementation of effective policies, the private sector has a huge role to play. Cities and states will need multiple funding sources in order to deliver the essential resources for low carbon development, as well as climate risk management. The federal government should invest directly in key parts of the national energy system to help states and cities. This includes interstate power transmission, public land use for power generation, as well as the supporting infrastructure. And also, we should establish programs at the state level to promote forest conservation and restoration, as well as agroforestry and urban forestry. Next slide. So investing, in terms of no regrets policies, investing in mitigation strategies that yield concurrent climate adaptation benefits should be prioritized. We can engage local governments and states in regional planning efforts that bring multiple states and cities and local governments together for both mitigation and adaptation. It's so important to promote interstate and interagency coordination. This includes, electricity demand modeling as well as land-based activities. But the important thing is that that regional collaboration will improve the outcomes for everyone. We're focused on electrification in this work, and so modernizing the grid and allowing the sharing and transmission of renewable resources within and between regions is absolutely crucial. And as Cynthia touched on earlier, measures to accomplish deep decarbonization, at minimum need to ensure that underserved communities are not disproportionately burdened, directing resources toward just transitions, through a variety of approaches will make climate action plans more responsive to equity concerns and really help galvanize the broader constituencies that will be needed in order for us to have bold climate solutions. Thank you. I'll hand it over to our next speaker.
Christian, thank you very much. Thank you in particular for stressing the importance of coordination, both across cities and towns, but across levels of government. That will absolutely be essential. And Cynthia, thank you as well for digging into what's going to be required in terms of that community scale participation in the effort. All of this is essential. Before we turn to questions and answers, and we now do have lots of questions that I'm going to try to put back to our presenters in some kind of a structured way, I want to invite Elena Crete from the SDSN staff to give us a little bit of a picture of where we go from here. In particular, the opportunity for all of you to take a deeper dive into a number of the topics we presented on briefly today, in overview form today, but there will be an upcoming set of webinars that will allow you to go 2 or 3 levels deeper into the details. So Elena, why don't you lay that out for us, and then we'll turn to questions and answers.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dan. So today in the last hour, we've heard from 11 of our 21 co-chairs that make up our Zero Carbon Consortium, which then has over 100 researchers who have participated. So obviously, they had very short presentations. We couldn't dive into a lot of the detail, but we want to make sure that the breadth and depth of this report really gets out there and that we further the general understanding of what's gone into this. So currently, we have 8 upcoming webinars that are more focused on our sector chapters. And so we invite you all to please join us, help us to promote these to get as many people in attendance as possible, where we're really going to dig into the details across these chapters and these sectors that we've only briefly covered today. And hopefully we'll get to many of your questions today, but most of them will also be answered if you go ahead and download and read our report and also join one of these upcoming webinars. So thank you. We'll put a link in the chat right now with how to register.
All right, we now turn to the opportunity to have all of you give us a push to answer some of the things you feel like we need to take up more fully. And I want to start with a couple of questions that have come in, but we're still open on the Q&A function, so feel free to add to what's already there. Perhaps the most significant question in terms of the number of people putting it forward in one form or another is the suggestion that this ZCAP depends on a supportive federal government. And in fact, there are a number of questions that suggest that we won't actually get this plan moving if the election next week were to go in certain directions. And so there's a question out there, do we need federal governments, a federal government leadership effort to get this done? And second, what's plan B if the election result does not produce that sort of federal government? I think I'm going to turn to Gordon McCord first, but invite any of our other speaker presenters to jump in after Gordon if they would like.
Thanks, Dan. Of course, that's a fundamental question, and the folks in the room are right to ask it. What's powerful about the United States in this context is the fact that we are a federalized nation. And so a lot of the decision-making power, a lot of the policies that need to put forward, a lot of the modeling and a lot of the investments will fall under state and local jurisdictions, as have been emphasized by Chris and Cynthia just a bit ago. So even in a scenario where the federal government is rather uncooperative with this agenda, I think that there's a lot in this plan that has the building blocks for what states who want an aggressive policy agenda over the next 4 years in terms of their investments, the modeling, the science that has to happen, how they coordinate with municipalities and among each other. There's a lot that can be done at state and local level, and the emphasis, I think, of where we can direct a lot of this energy can go towards state and local jurisdictions in the absence of federal government leadership on this.
So Gordon, I would just add to what you've said, and this also answers a question from Yukong Lee about the role of the private sector, that in addition to state and local governments, there's a lot of private sector enthusiasm for starting the process of moving towards the zero carbon future that is required to address climate change in a serious way. And the Yukong's question in particular raises the issue of Apple, that's recently committed to being a zero carbon company as of 2035. But the question goes on to say, there are criticisms of Apple in addition to its the praise it's gotten for its commitment on climate change. There are questions about its social performance. And does this mean that the companies that we might be relying on are not fully able with their commitments to get us where we need to go across all of the various issues on which action is required? And the truth is that everyone's going to have to step up their game to deliver this kind of a transition. I think what's exciting to see is the number of corporate leaders who have committed themselves, and every day a growing number commit. One of the most remarkable things of the last month was to see the business roundtable saying that it's time not just for action on climate change, but specifically for a charge, a carbon price of some kind. So I think you do have a private sector role here and a lot of goodwill on the part of corporate actors, small business, big business, tech businesses, more old line manufacturing, all seeing this transition as something that's required. I want to move next, if I can, to a question from Mustafa in Bangladesh. And maybe this is for Mike. It's a question around cement use as well as production, and whether that factors into our analysis and whether it needs to be addressed more specifically with policy. Recognizing, of course, in the United States, there's a certain amount of cement being put into buildings, although a push now for a transition away from cement. But this is also a question of US leadership for the rest of the world, where so much is being built out. So I don't know whether, Mike, you have something to start with, or Bob, you've got thoughts on how this gets modeled. But I think the question of whether cement can be decarbonized and how we play out both its production and its use. Mike Gerard first, and then we'll invite others.
So the materials chapter in the book does talk about that issue. Clearly, the fabrication of cement is itself a major greenhouse gas emitter. We need to be looking at the full life cycle impacts of all the materials that we use, and that has to be the global impacts. One of the discussions is about whether there should be trade tools that are used to try to inhibit the importation of materials that were fabricated using highly greenhouse gas intensive methods. But there's no question that the global impacts of cement fabrication are a significant chunk of the feature of the picture. Yes.
Mike, thanks. Bob, do you want to add anything, or you're on mute?
In terms of the areas of focus that we worked on, which is the transition, if you look at the model, the Williams-Jones model that is the centerpiece of this work, we are going to get to zero in the model, and that therefore we have to move away from high emissions activities such as cement generation and the use of cement in buildings. What would be the impact of that on jobs? Actually, it's very modest. I think generally my point is that the job impacts of moving out of a fossil fuel generating or an emission generating economy are easily manageable in principle. In principle, we have to commit to it. And so the area of cement, just like the area of coal, these are things that we can transition workers out of, give everyone a just transition, and therefore move much more readily and much more fulsome political support for a green transition.
And another aspect of this is the opportunity to substitute fuels in the cement production. Our report talks about the opportunity for hydrogen in a number of categories, including cement. Ryan, do you want to talk about that? We've got a question from Tracy Renaud about whether we can get to a green hydrogen future. So you can first talk about whether we, how we play hydrogen out in this plan, but also how we make sure we get to green hydrogen that is the true sustainable future in some regards.
Yeah, good question, Dan. I think hydrogen we find is a really important intermediate carrier in these energy system transitions. There are some applications like high temperature process heating or some on-road transportation where direct use of hydrogen likely makes a lot of sense, and where electrification is more challenging. With regard to the production of hydrogen, this is one of those areas in which I think some uncertainty emerges after 2035 as relates to kind of future technology progress of things like using either biomass to generate hydrogen, using fossil with carbon capture and storage to generate hydrogen, or getting hydrogen from electrolysis and ultimately from renewables as a primary energy source. I think there's likely going to be a diversity of those strategies that will in part depend on where we are in the US as well. It's one area where I think more research and development is certainly needed.
Thanks very much. By the way, there is the discussion of cement in detail in chapter 5.3, the industry chapter, for those who want to go deep on that. And we do have, as you've just heard, a discussion of hydrogen in some significant depth. I want to turn next to a question from Harriet Tregoning, and this one goes to pressing us on the question of the just transition. And she asked, how is it going to happen that there is protection provided for low-income and BIPOC communities, but not just income protection, job opportunities and small business opportunities? So I think maybe, Bob, this again goes to you, and maybe Christian to follow.
Right, and I'm sorry, I would have loved to have a full hour to discuss our study, and I will have an hour, I think, on November 10th. So we do talk about community transition in the chapter as well, and that is, of course, a central part. And so the investment project is a project that will take place in specific communities. And so that therefore, yes, we should focus incentivize the investment projects in clean energy and transition, in particular in communities that either will be negatively affected disproportionately by the phase out of the fossil fuels, or in communities that are already high unemployment communities, or communities that are facing the damage, environmental damage from having fossil fuel production activities or utilities in their communities at present. So that has to be part of the overall project, and that is definitely a major feature of thinking about the transition in terms of regions and communities. And the overarching point, though, is, again, this is such a positive, dynamic project overall, that there is going to be huge opportunities, if we do it right, to make sure that we target communities that have been negatively affected, that will be disproportionately impacted, and so forth.
Yeah,
Thanks,
I'll just add.
Christian, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just add that, it's so important to ensure that equity is a key part of the building retrofit efforts that happen amongst states and cities. When those building retrofits happen, there's an amazing opportunity there to hire folks from low-income communities, our folks that are people of color, are indigenous, are identified as Black. And so since building retrofits will be such a key part of decarbonization, we need to make sure there's equity in terms of hiring there. Cities like Atlanta have created job training programs where folks from low-income communities learn construction skills. And notably, the city of New York are in terms of their net zero carbon emissions planning by 2050, they're specifying about a third of of the benefits of the investments to go to disadvantaged communities. So we can kind of follow the lead of places like New York to make sure that the benefits associated with investments go to disadvantaged communities.
Christian, thank you very much. And thank you for emphasizing the importance of energy efficiency, which at least one questioner pointed out we had not hit very hard on. But I think energy efficiency in really all of the sectors being discussed is part of the story. There's a push here in terms of, and this goes to you, Vicki, a push as to whether this is part of the strategy on transportation alongside electrification.
Sure, and I invite our viewers to join us on Thursday for a deeper dive on the transportation chapter with my colleagues, who include folks that work not just on the electrification and the technology side, but also on the complete streets and VMT side, which we identify as a second significant opportunity in this sector, along with, I saw another question from Harriet, things like, of course, stringent CAFE and greenhouse gas standards, looking at something like fee-bates as a policy, but we do include, giving people alternative mobility options, whether it be, active transportation options, which have so many co-benefits in terms of public health and air quality, as we've seen in this COVID era, getting people out of their cars and having safe places for people to bike and walk is really important. So those are things that are definitely covered in the chapter more. We just didn't really get to it on this call.
Thanks. And again, I would encourage any of you who've got interest in particular elements of the strategy to join the webinars that Elena was laying out the schedule for. And I think we can post into the chat as well. It really is an opportunity to take this conversation down to the next level. And in doing so, we think you go to the strength of our effort of really getting to the granular level of analysis with the kind of experts that our consortium represents, digging in deep to the details. The next question I've got is from Diolinda Montero, and she's asking about whether the ZCAP, particularly the strategy, but perhaps also the modeling underneath it, deals with the many unknowns and uncertainties that begin to get bigger and bigger as you go out to 2050. So Mike Gerard or John Dernbach, this is a question that you all have had to think about in the context of the federal strategy and federal legislation. Do you want to offer some thoughts on how we deal with uncertainties as the decades pass?
Mike, you're muted.
You're muted.
We have to deal with the contingency that which way the election will go, and it makes a very big difference. It's true that if the election goes in one direction, not all is lost, but it's going to be much more difficult. And so there needs to be much more focus on state and local action. The further out we go, the more uncertainties there are. I mean, for instance, with motor vehicle standards, in order to have much stronger motor vehicle emission standards, we need federal action. If we don't get that as a result of the 2020 election, we might get that as a result of the 2024 election. So there is still time ahead, but there are some real contingencies here. John, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just a couple of things to add to, and this builds on, I think, the work that Ryan and Jim did. I mean, one of the things that we were really sensitive to in building our report on the technical work that Ryan Jones and Jim Williams did is, so what do we know now, and what do we not know now? And part of what we concluded is we've got a pretty good idea of what the next 10 years ought to look like, assuming in terms of what technologies are available and what policy courses of action seem appropriate. And that's why a lot of the recommendations that we made are directed particularly at the next 10 years. But beyond that, there are some uncertainties. Negative emissions technologies, for example, and other technologies that aren't even invented yet may play a pretty big role after 2030, but it's hard to talk about something that isn't even invented yet. And so I think what happens in terms of technology and cost is there are some uncertainties after 2030. And so our thought process was to focus on the next 10 years.
John, that's very helpful. It does lead us to another set of questions that have come in, which I think maybe go to Ryan. But that is around, in particular, carbon capture and storage. There's questions about whether this is going to be cost effective, whether it's going to add cost to energy if that becomes part of the package, particularly given that the ZCAP strategy includes some ongoing role for natural gas as the peaking support for the renewables that are being built out. So we have that question from Syed Alwater. And then Craig Zamuda is asking a related question about whether this is worth putting an effort into, that is to say carbon capture and storage, if the goal is really to try to move away from coal in particular. So one of the answers there may be that while we're going to see coal diminish dramatically and really be zeroed out quite quickly, the natural gas is anticipated to be present for at least some period of time. But Ryan, why don't you tell us what the thinking here is on carbon capture and where the modeling takes us?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that the modeling points to kind of a more nuanced set of results for carbon capture. So I think the first thing just to note is we distinguish carbon capture and use from carbon capture and storage. Across all of our scenarios, we have carbon that gets captured as a part of our zero carbon transition strategy. In some scenarios that becomes sequestered. In other scenarios, it gets used to synthesize fuels. And so we have one scenario which is based on 100% primary renewable energy use that has no geologic sequestration as part of the strategy. So that's kind of the first thing. The second thing is, if you look at the places where we could deploy carbon capture across the economy, we have electricity, which actually we find to be one of the less economic places to put carbon capture. Then you also have industry and emerging biorefining or biofuel production applications, both of which we do find to be kind of cost-effective and important places to capture carbon. So if you look at something like cement, which came up earlier, one of the important strategies that you can use to capture carbon in the case of process emissions from production of lime is carbon capture. The question is, what do you do with that once you've captured that carbon? And that's where some of this conversation about fuel strategy comes further into play. And really in particular, this is one of the places where there still is some uncertainty after the year 2035.
So Ryan, I'm going to keep you on the microphone if I can. With a minute remaining in our time here, I'm going to give you 3 quick questions for 10-second answers each.
All right.
So what's the role of nuclear in this game plan, particularly micronuclear that's emerging as a new technology?
Yeah, great question, Dan. So we see nuclear playing a large role if you cannot get the land use required for the renewable transition. I think it's an important technology to continue to invest in.
So thank you, Stacey Hobart, for that question. Now a question from Jesse Jenkins on biomass. How do you see this playing out? Are there constraints on where it could be used or should be used?
Yeah, I think the amount of biomass that we can sustainably produce in the U.S. is a major question, kind of on the peripheral of just carbon emissions for the environmental sustainability of this transition. We use the billion-ton study assumptions for that work, and we do not use all of the supply curve that the Department of Energy indicates may be available. But it is a greatly expanded use of biomass compared to today. So that's an important kind of further follow-up.
All right, one last 10-second question. What is the calculation around batteries? Obviously, electrification drives us to do more in the way of storage and batteries. Isn't there a significant environmental impact once those batteries have to be disposed of?
Yeah, I think for that reason, battery recycling is going to become more and more important as part of this transition. Most of the batteries that get used in a zero carbon transition are actually in the on-road transportation sector. And so recycling of automobile batteries, I think, is essential, as is extracting lithium for use in these batteries in an environmentally responsible way.
So I am afraid we're out of time for today. There are an enormous number of questions still being posed, which I'm sorry we won't get to, including important questions about the role of media in pushing the story and the strategy out in helping the transition, the role of culture in doing that, the role of mass mobilization to help facilitate the political structure behind delivering on a strategy like this. Also very interesting questions about how this strategy, the ZCAP, designed, of course, for the United States, might play in the developing world? Does it provide lessons or direction that we should take from the effort in the United States and transport to the developing world that must transition right alongside of us? And at least one questioner noting that there will be pressure for cost reasons to continue to use fossil fuels in the absence of new and low-cost technologies being brought to the developing world. I do want to say that it's been a great joy to work on this effort with so many talented researchers, scholars, innovators, thought leaders, and it really does reflect an enormous team effort. And I think it's an effort that is going to help put down a marker of how one gets to the zero carbon future that is now, I think, very much in the front end of the political conversation that begins right after the election. So there is a lot of enthusiasm about this. There's lots of discussion to be had. One of the other elements I can tell you, having been part of the dialogues, the ongoing dialogues over many months now that build up to today, is that this is also a crew, the consortium that put it together, committed to continuous improvement, refining of thinking, developing the strategy out over time. So we think of today not as the end of the discussion we've just had, but really the beginning of a very much ongoing conversation. And we encourage all of you to take what you've heard today and bring it to your own fora, to your own workplace, to your own field, to your own group. And from there, we will encourage you to push it out into the political arena as well, which will be very much critical. So Elena, thank you again for giving us a final reminder of the various upcoming webinars. We're eager to have you join us on any of these that you might find interesting and attractive, beginning tomorrow with power, transportation coming the day after. And then right after the election, we have buildings, our just transition discussion, policy and implementation, materials, industry, and then finally food and land. So we've got a whole set of conversations that we hope you'll come and join again. But thank you all for being part of this, and thank you for your interest in the Zero Carbon Action Plan.